take a second to take this in. It was supposed to be the first slide. Okay, FIDO2 will kill passwords. That's what the media has been telling us since 2019, when FIDO2 was first standardized for primary authentication to replace the password. We had the same story again in 2022 when Passkeys became a thing. The media again heralded them as the password conqueror and highlighted their phishing resistance and their ease of use. And as we believe that this all sounds quite amazing, we started questioning, why aren't we using passkeys? Sorry. To answer this question, we investigated obstacles that companies face deploying FIDO2 passwordless authentication by interviewing CISOs and experts from the FIDO Alliance, as well as authentication vendors. But before we get into the specifics of the study, I want to quickly catch everybody up on what FIDO2 and passkeys actually are. FIDO2 is a public key-based authentication standard, which works, as mentioned, entirely without passwords. So if the user wants to register at a website, a public-private key pair is created, where the private key is stored on the user device and the public key is stored on the website. For subsequent sign-ins, the private key is then used to sign a challenge, which the website can verify using the public key it stores. Passkeys are sort of an evolution of that, where the private key is also stored in the cloud, which makes logins across different devices easier. The security and usability community have actually evaluated those protocols quite thoroughly and came to the same conclusion as the media, that they are quite usable and fast, especially faster than passwords. There's just nothing to remember for the user, and the security benefits, such as phishing resistance and not having to store secret credentials on the server side, are also quite substantial. So to answer this question of why we aren't using passkeys, we investigated three main aspects. The first one being the awareness of and opinions about FIDO2 among those different stakeholders. We also investigated their experiences with passwordless deployments or why their organization hadn't deployed FIDO yet. And lastly, of course, the obstacles companies faced when deploying FIDO or think other companies may encounter when deploying FIDO. In total, we had 32 participants over the course of 28 interviews. 6 of those were FIDO experts, so they were either part of the FIDO Alliance itself or contributed substantially to the FIDO standards. 4 represented identity and access management vendors, and a total of 18 people represented organizations from a variety of different industries. And these people that we interviewed were always in a position where they would be able to make the decision to deploy FIDO or not, so CISOs or security engineers and so on. 13, so about half of our organizations had already deployed FIDO in their organization. However, this was mostly for employees, and only 1 organization was talking about customer-facing deployments at the time. The other half had not deployed FIDO for a variety of different reasons, which we will get to now. The majority of our participants, in fact, agreed that FIDO has sort of passed its inflection point, meaning that it is here to stay and will not vanish anytime soon. Authentication vendors also told us that among their customers, there's usually awareness there, and people are in fact willing to implement it. However, a company would usually not come explicitly asking for FIDO, but they are just happy if that is included in a packaged authentication deal. What we did notice, even among our participants, is that some had trouble differentiating traditional 2FA authentication, FIDO-based 2FA authentication, from the new passwordless single-factor authentication, which came with FIDO2. Continuing with our obstacles. In total, we extracted 5 larger categories of obstacles, which I will take you through 4 of those. Starting with the regulations. This was an issue brought up in the majority of interviews, in fact. For example, many companies were concerned that FIDO will clash with existing policies, such as password policies, which kind of by nature do not apply to a passwordless world, right? So this means that these companies will have to develop entirely new compliance frameworks, which are specifically tailored to the FIDO world. Another issue that arose specifically in the financial sector was that FIDO seemed to be clashing with some European regulations, such as the Payment Service Directive and the eIDAS. And this is also where the quote on the slide stems from, that no serious bank will use FIDO. The FIDO Alliance did tell us that they are aware of this issue and already talking to European legislators. However, at this point, we can just not be sure how this will play out in the long term. Continuing with the usability, a major concern surrounded the complexity of explaining FIDO, especially to management and also end users, because it's just much more complicated to explain public key crypto than to explain a password. We also identified some specific usability hardships, such as that the onboarding process seems to be not quite self-explanatory for non-technical people, and that it often required help from the IT department to set up security keys, for example. Especially the experts also criticized that browsers and websites implement the interfaces in very different ways oftentimes, which just makes it a lot harder for end users to recognize passkeys across different services as the same authentication mechanism. Lastly, the lack of a standardized fallback. Currently, the FIDO Alliance actually recommends to register multiple security keys, so if you lose one, you still have the other one to sign into your account. But as this participant on the slide also said, that's not really a great user experience at all. And you might be able to put up with this inconvenience in an enterprise setting, but definitely not for the broad consumer or the end user. The technical challenges were, according to our participants, not a major concern anymore, interestingly. However, again, it was highlighted that the FIDO standards are quite complex, also for developers. So this person, which we quoted here, implemented the standards themselves, and they said that many configurations options are just not obvious. There are combinations that don't make sense or that don't offer the protection that you might think. So especially the FIDO experts repeatedly recommended that organizations should rely on specialized vendors rather than trying to implement FIDO in-house, because that's possibly insecure then. Another large concern for organizations was FIDO's incompatibility with legacy software, which unfortunately still often forms a business-crucial application for many organizations. So they cannot just switch out this piece of software for something that is FIDO compatible. Lastly, I want to just quickly touch on what I personally would even call a political issue that was brought up in multiple interviews as well, which is that in theory, FIDO is an open standard, yes. But the FIDO Alliance itself is heavily driven and influenced by large, powerful corporations such as Google and Apple. And as the participant on the slide here said, that if Google has objections and they do not implement a feature in Chrome, it'll never gain adoption, which kind of hints at the problem that they have the power to stall developments if these developments do not align with their internal business goals. And this is just fundamentally different than what we had with passwords. So let's get back to this question from the beginning. Will FIDO kill the password? We think probably not in the near future, and we believe it's better to adopt the notion of FIDO will reduce the over-reliance on passwords, as this kind of describes a little bit more accurately what's probably going to happen in the next few years. Let's summarize what we learned shortly. We don't believe that we don't use passkeys yet because it's an issue of awareness or negative opinions. Awareness was there, and the opinions were overall really positive. Some companies didn't have super smooth deployments, but no one told us that they regretted their deployment, so we also don't think it's an issue of negative experiences. The obstacles we identified, however, do play a partial role, for example, in the financial industry, or if you're an industry that heavily relies on legacy software, your deployment might be much more complex. So we'd like to make a call to the community, to all of you, to continue working on those obstacles to ultimately make everyone's lives a little bit easier by having to use less passwords. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk, and I'm happy to answer all your questions.